Hey guys, tonight we start with something that'll make you grateful for your own bed. You think modern hotel stays are awkward? Try ancient Rome, where complete strangers didn't just share rooms, they shared the same mattress, the same blankets, sometimes even the same pillow. And here's the kicker. This wasn't poverty, this wasn't desperation, this was how the Roman Empire worked. We're not talking about one weird custom here. We're talking about an entire civilization where your sleeping arrangements could literally kill you, and everyone just accepted it. By the time we're done tonight, you'll understand why the mightiest empire in human history had a death rate that would make a medieval plague look manageable. This isn't just weird history. This is a world where privacy was a luxury only gods could afford. Picture this. You're walking through Rome in 150 AD. The city stretches beyond the horizon, 1 million people crammed into a space smaller than modern Manhattan. The smell hits you first, human waste, cooking fires, unwashed bodies, and something else, something rotting. You're not entering a world of marble palaces, that's tourist Rome. Real Rome is wooden apartment buildings reaching 6-7 stories high, swaying in the wind like drunk sailors. These insulae, island buildings, house 95% of the population. And inside these architectural nightmares, people don't just live together, they sleep together. Strangers, families, slaves, free citizens, all in the same spaces, on the same surfaces. The social structure you're about to experience defies everything you think you know about personal space. Romans had a concept called necessitas, necessity, that overruled every modern assumption about privacy, hygiene, and personal boundaries. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if these whispered histories truly earn it. Every click keeps our lantern glowing, and your support genuinely fuels me to bring more drowsy tales. Now tell me what corner of the globe you're dozing in, and what hour the clock just sighed. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially when we're about to explore the most dangerous sleep culture in human history. Quick check that privacy you're experiencing right now, Romans would consider you impossibly wealthy, not because you have money, but because you're alone. We're diving into a world where your sleeping partner might be a complete stranger, and your chances of surviving the night depended on factors you couldn't even see. The greatest empire ever built created the perfect conditions for its own destruction, one shared bed at a time, and the Romans knew. Let's start with Marcus Flavius, a real Roman whose story survives in ancient records. Marcus arrives in Rome from Gaul with 3 coins and a letter of introduction. He finds lodging in a 4th-floor insula room that costs 1 denarius per night. Here's what that money gets him: a space the size of a modern walk-in closet, shared with 5 other men. But here's where it gets weird. These aren't his friends. These aren't his relatives. One is a Syrian merchant named Khalil. Another is a Germanic tribesman called Wolf, who speaks exactly 7 words of Latin. The third is Gaius, a Roman citizen so broke he's sleeping next to barbarians. The 4th is someone whose name nobody knows. He paid his denarius. They share 1 straw mattress. When I say share, I mean they literally sleep body to body, hip against hip, back against the chest, breathing each other's exhalations all night long. The mattress isn't big enough for 5 grown men, so they sleep in shifts. 3 sleep while 2 sit against the wall. At midnight, they rotate. Now picture this. Marcus has been traveling for 2 weeks. He hasn't bathed because public baths cost extra money he doesn't have. Khalil has dysentery from bad fish sauce he ate 3 days ago. Wolf has an infected wound from a bar fight in Gaul. Gaius has been coughing up blood for a month but can't afford a doctor. The nameless stranger. Nobody knows what's wrong with him, but something is. He keeps making sounds in his sleep that aren't quite human. They're not just sharing space, they're sharing diseases, sharing parasites, sharing every microscopic horror their bodies are hosting. And this isn't rock bottom, This is normal Tuesday night accommodation in the greatest city on earth. But why would anyone choose this? Here's the thing that'll blow your mind. They didn't choose it. The math chose it for them. A private room in Rome, just one room, no bigger than a modern bathroom, costs 12 denarii per night. The average Roman worker makes 30 denarii per month. Do that math. Even if you spent literally nothing on food, clothing, or anything else, you could afford a private room for 2.5 nights per month. But it gets worse. Remember, Romans don't have the concept of weekends. You work 7 days a week, or you don't eat. Miss 1 day of work and you're sleeping in the streets. Miss 2 days and you're dead. The economic pressure isn't just tight, it's suffocating, so sharing becomes survival. But the Romans, being Romans, turned this necessity into a system. They created professional bed sharers called lectari, bed partners who specialized in being good roommates. These guys developed skills we can barely imagine. A professional lectarius could sleep so still he wouldn't wake his bedmates. He could time his breathing to match the room's rhythm. He could position his body to take up exactly 1/5 of the mattress space. No more, no less. Some could even sleep sitting up against the wall for the entire night, making more space for paying customers. But here's the part that'll make you question everything. The best lectari weren't chosen for cleanliness or health. They were chosen for heat generation. Roman apartments had no heating. None. In winter, body heat was the only warmth available. A good bed partner could mean the difference between waking up alive or freezing to death in your sleep. They literally valued human radiators over human hygiene. And in a city where winter temperatures regularly dropped below freezing, this made perfect horrible sense. So picture Marcus again, but now it's January. Snow is falling on Rome. Yes, it snowed in ancient Rome, and the temperature in his room is the same as outside. The only warmth comes from 5 men pressed together like sardines, sharing breath, sharing heat, sharing everything their bodies produced. The intimacy wasn't romantic. It wasn't even friendly. It was thermal, pure survival physics. And it was killing them in ways they couldn't even comprehend. Romans had no concept of germs. None. They believed disease came from bad air, literally malaria. They thought you got sick from breathing the wrong winds or standing in the wrong shadows. This ignorance turned every shared sleeping space into a biological weapon. Let me walk you through what actually happened in Marcus's room on any given night. Remember Khalil with dysentery. He's not just sick, he's shedding salmonella with every breath. The bacteria are invisible to Romans, but they're coating every surface, every fabric, every piece of shared bedding. Wolf's infected wound, that's probably Staphylococcus aureus, what we'd now call a staph infection. But in ancient Rome, it's just bad humor. Nobody connects his pus-filled gash to the mysterious fevers that keep striking his bedmates. Gaius coughing up blood, classic tuberculosis symptoms. TB spreads through airborne droplets, and in a room where 5 men sleep inches apart, sharing the same stale air for 8 hours every night, every cough is like firing a bacterial shotgun. But here's the kicker, the thing that would make a modern epidemiologist scream. They're not just sharing diseases, they're sharing vectors. Every Roman sleeper carried fleas, fleas carrying typhus, body lice carrying trench fever, bed bugs carrying God knows what. When you press 5 flea-infested bodies together for hours, you create a biological exchange system that would make a CDC researcher faint. The mattresses never got cleaned, water was precious, soap was expensive, and besides, Romans thought washing too much was unhealthy. They believed it opened your pores to evil spirits. So these straw mattresses accumulated months, sometimes years of human secretions, parasites, bacteria, and bodily fluids from hundreds of different sleepers. Modern microbiologists have studied similar conditions in refugee camps and disaster zones. The disease transmission rates are catastrophic, but refugee camps are temporary emergency situations. Romans lived like this for centuries, and the strangest part, they kept detailed records of everything except this. We have Roman documents about tax collection, military campaigns, even grocery lists, but sleeping arrangements, the thing that was literally killing them, barely mentioned. It was so normal, so universal, that it was invisible. Just like the microscopic killers sharing their beds. Let's climb the stairs of a typical Roman insula and see how architecture became accomplice to mass death. Ground floor, mine subs, and wealthy apartments with actual windows, decent ventilation, stone walls, proper drainage. The people who can afford this level rarely die from sleep-related diseases. Second floor middle-class Romans. Smaller rooms, shared walls, less airflow, still tolerable, but you can smell the problems starting. Third floor walking poor, wood construction now, thinner walls, windows barely bigger than arrow slits. The smell is getting stronger, walking fires, human waste, and something else. Fourth floor Marcus's world. No proper windows, just holes in the wall covered with cloth. No drainage, no ventilation system, no way for bad air to escape or fresh air to enter. The cooking fires from below send smoke rising through the floors. The waste from above seeps down through the wood. Fifth floor Morkinged, where desperation lives. The rooms are smaller, the ceilings lower, the air thicker. People sleeping here are one economic disaster away from the streets. Sixth floor Morkinged, the top of the misery pyramid. Rooms so small you can't stand up straight. No natural light. The air is so stale, it's practically solid. The people sleeping up here are sharing not just beds but oxygen. Here's the thing that'll horrify you. The higher you go, the cheaper the rent gets. But also, the higher you go, the more people share each room. It's the reverse economics of survival. The poorest Romans got the worst air, the most crowded conditions, and the highest disease transmission rates. But the architecture wasn't just accidentally deadly, it was economically optimized for death. Landlords knew these upper floors killed people. They planned for it. Tenant turnover was built into the business model. When someone died from sharing air with strangers, there was always another desperate Roman ready to take their place. The insula were basically vertical plague factories, and everyone knew it. Even the landlords wouldn't sleep in their own buildings. But Romans weren't stupid. They developed elaborate survival rituals around shared sleeping that showed just how desperate their situation was. The sleeping order wasn't random. Healthiest sleepers got the wall positions, better air circulation, and less chance of being coughed on directly. Sick people slept in the middle, where their body heat was most useful, but their diseases were most contained. New arrivals always got the foot end of the mattress, where they'd be first to catch any illness, but last to spread their own. They developed a shared sleeping language. Coughs had meanings. A dry cough meant, "I'm not contagious, just dust in my lungs." A wet cough meant, "Stay away from my side of the bed." Blood in cough meant, "I'll be dead soon. Start looking for a replacement." Romans created bathroom schedules, not because they were polite, but because dysentery was so common they had to organize around it. The chamber pot mitch, a single pot shared by 5 men, had designated times. Miss your window and you either held it all night, or relieved yourself in the bedding. They developed breathing patterns. Experienced bed sharers learned to breathe in rhythm, reducing the accumulation of stale air. They'd synchronize their inhalation and exhalation, creating tiny air currents in the stagnant room atmosphere. Most disturbing of all, Mitch, they created death protocols. When someone died in their sleep, which happened constantly, the survivors had specific procedures. Check for rigor mortis. Remove the body before it starts attracting more insects. Clean the bedding with whatever water they could afford. Find a replacement sleeper before nightfall. Death wasn't tragic in these rooms. It was logistical. A dead bedmate meant lost body heat and increased rent burden for the survivors. Grief was a luxury they couldn't afford. But here's what's really twisted. These survival rituals actually worked. Romans who followed them lived longer than those who didn't. Not long enough, but longer. They were accidentally developing public health practices without understanding the science behind them. The question is, if they could organize around death this efficiently, why couldn't they just not share beds with strangers? This is where Roman culture gets really twisted. They didn't just tolerate sharing beds with strangers, they convinced themselves it was better this way. Romans developed an entire philosophy around communal sleeping called fraternitas necessaria, necessary brotherhood. They believed that sharing sleep with strangers built character, taught humility, and connected them to the common human experience. Wealthy Romans who slept alone were considered soft, disconnected, almost inhuman. This wasn't just practical rationalization, this was cultural programming. Roman children grew up believing that private sleeping was selfish, that sharing your bed was a civic duty. They told stories of heroes who shared their beds with enemies and converted them through the intimacy of sleep. But beneath this cultural conditioning was something darker, learned helplessness on a civilizational scale. Romans convinced themselves they preferred communal sleeping because the alternative, knitting their empire was failing its own people, was psychologically unbearable. They created elaborate social hierarchies around bed sharing. The person closest to the door was the guardian, responsible for waking everyone if danger approached. The person at the head of the bed was the patriarch, usually the oldest or most experienced sleeper. The feet position was for newcomers or people who'd lost social standing. These weren't just sleeping arrangements. They were miniature societies forming and dissolving every night. Friendships formed across language barriers. Business deals were negotiated in whispers. Marriage proposals happened between strangers who'd shared warmth for weeks, but also murders, sexual assaults, thefts. When you force desperate people into intimate spaces with no privacy and no escape, human nature shows its full range. The same bed that saved Marcus from freezing might be where he got his throat cut by the nameless stranger sleeping beside him. Romans developed an entire legal framework around bed-sharing crimes. If someone stole from their bedmate, it was considered more serious than regular theft, like betraying family. If someone killed their sleeping partner, it was treated almost like fratricide. The twisted part, this legal framework acknowledged how dangerous bed sharing was while simultaneously reinforcing it as normal and necessary. They knew they were dying, they just couldn't imagine living any other way. Everything we've discussed so far, for Roman women it was infinitely worse. Roman women couldn't travel alone, couldn't rent rooms alone, couldn't even sleep alone without male guardianship. When a woman needed lodging in Rome, she didn't just share beds with strangers, she shared beds with strange men who had legal authority over her body. Meet Livia, not the Empress, a common baker's daughter from Britannia. She arrives in Rome with her brother, who promptly dies of fever 3 days later. Now she's alone in a city where women can't exist independently. Her options: find a male guardian, get married immediately, become a prostitute, or die. She chooses the guardian option, a Syrian merchant who agrees to protect her in exchange for services. This isn't marriage, this isn't even concubinage, this is survival sex wrapped in legal fiction. Her guardian gets them a room shared with 4 other men and 2 other women in similar circumstances. 7 people, 1 mattress, and Livia sleeps between her guardian and a Germanic warrior who speaks no Latin but understands exactly what kind of protection she needs. Roman law technically protected women from sexual assault by bedmates, but only if they could prove an assault occurred, could identify their attacker in the dark, and could find male witnesses willing to testify. In practice, women sleeping in shared accommodations had no protection except what their guardians provided. And those guardians, they were often the biggest threat. A male guardian had legal right to a woman's body, her labor, and her possessions. If he died or abandoned her, she became available to any other man willing to assume guardianship. Women were traded between bed-sharing groups like property. But here's the part that makes it even more horrific. Many women preferred this system. The alternative was the streets, where life expectancy was measured in days, not months. Better to share a disease-infested bed with potential rapists than freeze to death alone in an alley. Roman women developed their own survival strategies. They traveled in pairs when possible, harder to abuse two women than one. They learned to sleep with small knives hidden in their clothing. They formed protective alliances with other women in their sleeping groups. Most importantly, they learned to make themselves useful beyond sex. Women who could cook, clean wounds, or tell stories were more valuable alive than dead. They became integral to the sleeping group's survival. But the price, their humanity. Roman women in shared sleeping arrangements stopped being people and became resources to be managed, protected, and exploited. The empire that prided itself on legal sophistication had created a system where half its population survived through institutionalized sexual vulnerability. Now let's talk about what happened when these Roman bed-sharing practices went mobile. Roman ships were floating versions of the insulae, with even deadlier consequences. A typical Roman merchant vessel carried 50 to 100 passengers crammed into a cargo hold designed for grain sacks. No separate sleeping quarters, no privacy, no ventilation except what came through the hatch above. When storms hit and that hatch closed, passengers shared the same recycled air for days. But ships added new horrors to the bed-sharing experience. Seasickness meant people vomiting on their sleeping partners. Dysentery meant, well, let's just say the ship's bilge wasn't just seawater. And when someone died at sea, which happened constantly, the body couldn't be removed immediately. Romans had to sleep next to corpses waiting for proper sea burial. Meet Quintus Maximus, a grain merchant traveling from Alexandria to Ostia, with a ship full of Egyptian wheat and Roman passengers. Day 3 of the journey, a passenger named Brutus starts showing plague symptoms. By Roman logic, they should isolate him. But there's nowhere to isolate anyone on a packed ship. Brutus sleeps in the communal passenger area, pressed against other travelers, coughing blood onto shared blankets, spreading bubonic plague with every breath. The ship's captain knows what's happening, but can't afford to change course. The wheat shipment is worth more than passenger lives. By day 7, 12 passengers are dead. By day 10, the crew starts dying. The ship limps into Ostia's harbor carrying grain, corpses, and survivors who immediately spread plague throughout Rome's port district. This wasn't unusual. This was Tuesday. Roman maritime trade required accepting massive disease transmission as a cost of doing business. Ship manifests routinely included expected mortality calculations, how many passengers they could afford to lose while maintaining profitability. But here's what's truly insane. Romans kept traveling this way. They knew the risks. They'd heard stories of plague ships arriving with more corpses than living passengers. They knew that sharing sleeping space on ships was often a death sentence. They did it anyway, because the alternative was staying poor, staying local, staying trapped in their small corner of the empire. The Roman road network gets all the historical attention, but the real connective tissue of the empire was these floating death traps, spreading diseases and cultural practices from Britain to Egypt, creating a Mediterranean-wide network of shared sleeping arrangements that slowly poisoned an entire civilization. The Roman military was the only institution that figured out the bed-sharing problem, and their solution reveals just how solvable this crisis actually was. Roman legions didn't share beds with strangers, ever. Military regulations specifically prohibited it. Soldiers slept in assigned groups of 8 men called contubernia, tent mates, who trained together, fought together, and yes, slept together. But these weren't strangers randomly thrown together by economic desperation. These men knew each other's medical histories. They'd been examined by military doctors. They followed strict hygiene protocols. They had designated sleeping positions based on rank and experience. Most importantly, if someone got sick, the group had procedures for isolation and treatment. Roman military camps were models of public health that civilian Rome ignored completely. Latrines were positioned downhill from water sources. Sleeping areas were elevated and ventilated. Sick soldiers were quarantined immediately. Dead soldiers were buried according to strict protocols that prevented disease spread. But here's the kicker. Roman soldiers were recruited from the same population dying in civilian bed-sharing arrangements. The same men who couldn't survive sharing a mattress with strangers somehow thrived when the military organized their sleeping arrangements properly. The difference wasn't the men, it was the system. The military proved that communal sleeping could work if you controlled disease transmission, maintained hygiene standards, and organized sleeping groups rationally. So why didn't civilian Rome adopt military sleeping practices? Simple, they couldn't afford it. Military sleeping arrangements required resources, organization, and planning. Civilian bed sharing was driven by poverty, desperation, and economic collapse. The Roman military was essentially a parallel civilization that had solved the problems killing everyone else. But instead of scaling these solutions to civilian life, Rome kept them confined to the legions. It was like having the cure for a plague and using it only on soldiers while letting everyone else die. Roman generals knew this. They'd grown up in civilian Rome, survived the bed-sharing death lottery, and then experienced military efficiency. They could see exactly how fixable their civilization's problems were. But fixing civilian Rome would have required restructuring the entire economy, redistributing wealth, and admitting that the empire's success was built on acceptable levels of civilian death. Much easier to maintain two separate systems, organized military efficiency and chaotic civilian suffering. The tragedy isn't that Romans didn't know better. The tragedy is that they did know better and chose not to apply that knowledge where it was needed most. Roman children didn't gradually learn to share beds with strangers. They were born into it, and the psychological damage was as devastating as the physical disease. A typical Roman child's first memory wasn't playing with toys or learning to walk. It was sleeping pressed against unknown adults who might be dead by morning. Children learned to identify disease symptoms before they learned the alphabet. They could recognize the smell of gangrene, the sound of death rattles, the feel of fever through shared blankets. Roman children developed survival skills that would horrify modern child psychologists. They learned to sleep with one eye open. Literally, they mastered the art of shallow breathing to avoid inhaling too much contaminated air. They could identify dangerous sleeping partners by smell, sound, and touch. But the psychological adaptations were worse than the physical ones. Roman children learned that human intimacy meant danger, that strangers touching your body was normal, that privacy was an impossible dream, that other people's bodily functions, diseases, and deaths were just background noise to ignore. They grew up with no concept of personal space, personal hygiene, or personal safety. A Roman child's idea of luxury wasn't toys or games, it was sleeping alone, just once, without strangers breathing on them. Child mortality rates in Roman bed-sharing arrangements were catastrophic. Modern historians estimate that 60 to 70% of Roman children born into the insulae died before age 10, not from malnutrition or neglect, but from diseases transmitted through shared sleeping spaces. But surviving Roman children became uniquely adapted to their environment. They developed immune systems that could handle constant exposure to multiple diseases. They learned social skills for managing complex sleeping group dynamics. They became experts at reading human behavior in the dark. The tragedy, these survival skills were exactly what Roman society needed. Adults who could navigate complex social situations, handle physical hardship, and maintain group cohesion under extreme stress. Roman children were being trained to be perfect citizens of a dying civilization, and the children who survived this brutal education became the adults who perpetuated it. They couldn't imagine childhood any other way because they'd never experienced safety, privacy, or individual sleeping space. They thought their traumatic upbringing was normal, healthy, character building. Roman parenting advice literally included instructions on preparing your child for communal sleeping, how to teach toddlers not to cry when strangers touched them, how to train children to sleep through other people's nightmares, how to help kids develop appropriate relationships with non-family sleeping partners. They were systematically traumatizing their own children and calling it education. As Roman society collapsed under the weight of its own sleeping arrangements, religion stepped in with explanations that made everything worse. Traditional Roman religion interpreted disease as divine punishment for moral failures. If you got sick from sharing a bed with strangers, you obviously hadn't made proper sacrifices to the household gods. If you died from transmitted diseases, you'd angered the spirits of your ancestors. The solution wasn't better hygiene, it was more religious ritual. Roman priests developed elaborate purification ceremonies around communal sleeping. Before entering shared beds, Romans would pray to specific gods for protection from evil vapors. They'd burn incense to ward off diseases they couldn't see or understand. They'd make offerings to ensure their sleeping partners weren't possessed by harmful spirits. None of this helped, but it made Romans feel like they were doing something about their situation while avoiding any real solutions. Then Christianity arrived with even more destructive interpretations. Early Christian preachers taught that physical suffering was spiritually purifying. Sharing beds with diseased strangers wasn't a social problem. It was an opportunity to demonstrate Christ-like love through self-sacrifice. Christian Romans began deliberately seeking out the sickest sleeping partners as acts of religious devotion. They'd volunteer to share beds with plague victims, TB patients, people with infected wounds. They called it embracing the cross of communal suffering. The results were predictable. Christian communities had even higher disease transmission rates than traditional Roman sleeping groups. But instead of reconsidering their practices, they interpreted the deaths as martyrdom, the suffering as blessed, the disease transmission as God's mysterious plan. But here's where it gets really twisted. Both Roman and Christian religious leaders lived privately. Priests had individual sleeping quarters. Bishops had private bedrooms. Religious authorities preached the spiritual benefits of communal suffering while carefully avoiding it themselves. Roman religious texts from this period are full of advice on sacred sleeping arrangements and divine communal rest. But they're written by people who'd never spent a night sharing a mattress with disease-infected strangers. It's like getting dietary advice from someone who's never been hungry. The religious response to Rome's bed-sharing crisis reveals something crucial about the empire's psychology. They preferred supernatural explanations for their suffering to acknowledging that their economic and social systems were killing them. Religion became another way to make the unbearable seem meaningful, the preventable seem inevitable, and the solvable seem divinely ordained. Let's follow the money and see exactly who was profiting from Roman bed-sharing arrangements. Because someone was getting rich from all this death. At the top of the pyramid, wealthy landlords who owned the insulae, but never set foot inside them. These weren't small-time slumlords. They were senators, equestrian-class Romans, sometimes even members of the imperial family. They viewed their rental properties as investment portfolios, not human housing. A typical wealthy Roman might own 50, 100 rental properties across the city. They calculated profitability based on maximum occupancy density, minimal maintenance costs, and acceptable mortality rates. Dead tenants meant turnover costs, but also opportunities to raise rent for desperate new occupants. Second tier, property managers who handled day-to-day operations. These guys lived well, but not luxuriously. Their job was squeezing maximum profit from human misery, while maintaining plausible deniability about living conditions. They collected rent, evicted corpses, and found replacement tenants. Third tier, the bed brokers, entrepreneurs who specialized in organizing sleeping arrangements. They matched compatible strangers, managed sleeping group dynamics, and took a cut of everyone's rent. Good bed brokers could increase a room's occupancy by 30 to 40% through efficient human packing. Fourth tier, professional bed sharers who made their living as sleeping partners. They marketed themselves based on cleanliness, quietness, heat generation, and medical history. The most successful ones could afford their own private rooms, but chose to keep sharing beds for the income. Fifth tier, everyone else, competing for the remaining sleeping space. But here's the truly sick part. The Roman government taxed bed-sharing arrangements. There was literally a communal sleeping tax based on occupancy density. The more people crammed into a room, the higher the tax rate. The government was directly profiting from conditions that were killing its own citizens. Roman tax records show that bed-sharing revenue was a significant portion of urban income tax collection. The empire's finances partially depended on maintaining the exact conditions that were destroying the empire's population, and everyone in the system knew it was unsustainable. Wealthy Romans wrote extensively about the lower-class dying problem and its impact on the labor supply. They understood that massive civilian mortality was economically inefficient long-term, but short-term profits were too good to give up. Why invest in better housing when desperate people would pay premium prices for death traps? Why solve the bed-sharing crisis when it was generating enormous tax revenue and keeping property values high in wealthy neighborhoods? The Roman economy had become addicted to profiting from the slow death of its own people. Not everyone died. Some Romans figured out how to survive decades of bed sharing with strangers, and their strategies revealed just how brutal this system really was. The first survival secret: become too valuable to lose. Romans who developed specialized skills, medical knowledge, language translation, business connections, could negotiate better sleeping arrangements. They weren't just paying for bed space, they were selling their expertise to the sleeping group. Marcus Tullius, different Marcus, this one from Gaul, survived 23 years of communal sleeping by becoming a human pharmacy. He learned to identify and treat common diseases, set broken bones, and perform basic surgery with kitchen knives. His sleeping partners kept him alive because losing him meant losing their only medical care. The second secret: master the politics. Every sleeping group was a miniature civilization with complex social dynamics. Successful survivors learned to read these dynamics and position themselves as essential peacekeepers, negotiators, or leaders. They became the glue holding desperate groups together. The third secret: develop disease resistance through controlled exposure. Some Romans deliberately exposed themselves to mild versions of common diseases when they were young and healthy, building immunity for later years. It was like primitive vaccination through calculated infection. The fourth secret: maintain emergency exit strategies. Smart Romans always knew exactly how to leave their current sleeping arrangement within 24 hours. They kept backup money hidden, cultivated alternative housing connections, and never became completely dependent on any single group. But here's the darkest secret: successful bed-sharing survivors learned to exploit others' desperation. They'd identify the most vulnerable new arrivals and charge them premium prices for protection or guidance. They became predators within the system that was already preying on them. These survival strategies worked, but they required becoming someone you might not recognize: calculating, manipulative, emotionally hardened. The Roman bed-sharing system didn't just kill people's bodies, it killed their souls, turning victims into perpetrators, survivors into exploiters. The Romans who lived longest in shared sleeping arrangements weren't the nicest people, they were the most ruthless ones. The system rewarded sociopathy and punished compassion, and these survivors became the teachers for the next generation, passing down strategies that made the system even more brutal and efficient at destroying human dignity while keeping people technically alive. By 250 AD, Roman bed-sharing arrangements had reached a critical mass of dysfunction that threatened the entire empire's stability. The system wasn't just killing individuals anymore, it was killing Roman civilization itself. The disease transmission networks created by shared sleeping had become so efficient that any epidemic introduced anywhere in the empire would spread to every major city within months. When the plague of Cyprian hit in 249 AD, it followed the bed-sharing routes like a highway system, jumping from one sleeping group to another with mathematical precision. But the plague revealed something even more terrifying. Romans had become so adapted to their bed-sharing culture that they couldn't survive any other way. When authorities tried to implement emergency isolation measures, people kept clustering together in shared sleeping arrangements. They literally didn't know how to sleep alone anymore. Romans who'd spent their entire lives sharing body heat with strangers would die of hypothermia when forced into individual quarters. Their immune systems, adapted to constant low-level disease exposure, couldn't handle the shock of clean environments. The bed-sharing system had created a population of humans who were biologically dependent on the exact conditions that were killing them. It was like a civilization-wide Stockholm syndrome, but with microbes instead of captors. Roman military records from this period describe entire legions collapsing when recruited from heavily bed-sharing urban populations. Soldiers who'd survived decades of communal civilian sleeping would die within weeks of military hygiene standards. Their bodies couldn't function without constant pathogen exposure, but the economic breaking point was even more brutal. The bed-sharing economy had become so central to Roman urban finance that any disruption threatened complete civilizational collapse. Property values, tax revenues, labor supply, commercial activity, everything depended on maintaining the death trap housing system. When Emperor Decius tried to implement housing reforms in 250 AD, the economic disruption was immediate and catastrophic. Landlords couldn't maintain profitability with lower occupancy density. Property managers couldn't cover their costs without bed-sharing fees. Entire neighborhoods emptied as people couldn't afford reformed housing. The reforms lasted 6 months before economic reality forced their abandonment. Rome had become trapped in a system where solving the bed-sharing crisis would destroy the empire's finances, but maintaining it would destroy the empire's people. They'd created the perfect trap, a civilization that could neither continue nor change without dying. But here's the most insane part. Some Romans understood exactly what was happening and proposed solutions that could have saved the empire. Senator Marcus Aurelius Severus wrote detailed reform proposals showing how gradual transition to individual sleeping could be economically sustainable over 20 years. His proposals were rejected, not because they wouldn't work, but because they would require wealthy Romans to accept lower short-term profits. The Senate chose civilizational suicide over temporary financial inconvenience. By 280 AD, Roman bed-sharing had reached a critical mass where it was generating more economic value than the entire agricultural sector. The empire was literally more profitable from people dying in shared beds than from growing food to keep them alive. That's when smart Romans knew their civilization was doomed. When your economy depends more on optimizing human death than sustaining human life, collapse isn't just inevitable, it's already happened. You're just waiting for someone to notice. But here's what makes the Roman bed-sharing tragedy even more infuriating. Some provinces figured out alternatives, and Rome actively suppressed them. In Roman Britain, local administrators developed a modified housing system where strangers shared buildings but not beds. British insulae had individual sleeping alcoves within communal spaces. People shared cooking areas, heating costs and security, but maintained separate sleeping surfaces. Disease transmission rates dropped by 60%. Tenant mortality fell dramatically. Property values actually increased because people would pay premium prices for buildings where they weren't likely to die. The British model proved that communal living could work without communal dying. Rome's response? They banned it. Imperial Decree 847 specifically prohibited excessive privatization of sleeping arrangements in provincial housing. The official reason was maintaining Roman cultural unity. The real reason was protecting metropolitan property investments. Roman Gaul developed even more innovative solutions. Gallic administrators created rotating sleeping schedules where strangers shared beds in shifts rather than simultaneously. One person slept while others worked, eliminating the disease transmission that came from multiple bodies in contact. They also implemented basic hygiene requirements: regular mattress replacement, mandatory bathing for bed sharers, health inspections for communal sleeping facilities. Mortality rates plummeted, labor productivity soared, regional economic growth exploded. Rome shut that down too. Imperial investigators arrived in Gaul with orders to restore traditional Roman sleeping practices. They destroyed the hygiene infrastructure, banned the rotation schedules, and forced Gallic Romans back into the death trap arrangements. Even more tragic, Roman Egypt had maintained traditional Egyptian housing practices that completely avoided bed-sharing problems. Egyptian Romans slept on individual reed mats in communal spaces, maintaining social cohesion without bodily contact. They had the lowest urban disease rates in the entire empire. Roman administrators spent decades trying to force Egyptian Romans into proper bed-sharing arrangements. They taxed individual sleeping surfaces at punitive rates. They offered economic incentives for adopting metropolitan sleeping practices. They eventually succeeded in destroying one of the few functional housing systems in the empire. The pattern was consistent across all provinces. Local solutions that actually worked were systematically destroyed to maintain imperial uniformity. Rome preferred a unified dying culture to diverse surviving ones. The provincial experiments proved that Roman bed sharing wasn't inevitable, necessary, or unsolvable. It was a choice that Rome's leadership made repeatedly, consciously, and catastrophically. The empire didn't fail because they couldn't solve their problems. They failed because they refused to implement solutions that already existed. By 300 AD, Romans had evolved into something that wasn't quite human anymore. 3 centuries of sleeping with diseased strangers had created a population adapted for conditions that no healthy civilization should tolerate. Roman children born into late empire bed-sharing arrangements displayed physiological changes that modern medical science can barely explain. Their lung capacity was enlarged to process contaminated air more efficiently. Their immune systems were hyperactive to the point of autoimmune dysfunction. Their sleep patterns were fragmented into 2-hour cycles that allowed constant environmental monitoring. They developed enhanced night vision for navigating dark, crowded sleeping spaces. Their sense of smell could identify specific diseases by scent. Their hearing could detect the difference between normal sleep sounds and death rattles. They were becoming specialized for survival in conditions that were killing normal humans, but the psychological adaptations were even more extreme. Late Empire Romans showed emotional responses that anthropologists classify as adaptive psychopathy. They could form and abandon intimate relationships within hours. They could sleep peacefully next to dying strangers. They could negotiate life or death sleeping arrangements with the emotional detachment of modern financial traders. These weren't mental illnesses, they were survival features. Romans who maintained normal human empathy, privacy needs and hygiene standards died quickly in bed-sharing arrangements. Only the emotionally adapted survived to reproduce. Roman medical texts from this period describe these adaptations as evolutionary improvements. They celebrated children who could sleep through plague symptoms. They praised adults who could share beds with rotting corpses without psychological distress. They treated normal human revulsion to diseased intimacy as a character flaw to be corrected. The most disturbing adaptation: Romans developed sexual practices specifically designed for communal sleeping arrangements. They learned to have intimate relationships while pressed against strangers in shared beds. They developed techniques for privacy-free courtship, pregnancy, and childbirth. Roman sexuality became performative and public by necessity. Private intimacy was literally impossible, so they adapted by making all intimacy semi-public. Marriage ceremonies included rituals for introducing spouses to existing bed-sharing groups. Wedding nights happened with strangers sleeping inches away. By the late Empire, Romans couldn't comprehend privacy-based relationships. The idea of sleeping alone with a romantic partner seemed weird, antisocial, almost perverted. They'd been so completely adapted to communal intimacy that individual intimacy felt wrong. These adaptations allowed Roman civilization to continue functioning even as it was dying, but they also made Romans less recognizably human with each generation. The bed-sharing system was gradually transforming them into a different species, one specialized for surviving in conditions that would kill their ancestors. The saddest part, they were proud of these adaptations. They saw their ability to thrive in deadly conditions as proof of Roman superiority, Roman toughness, Roman civilization. Here's the ultimate irony: the barbarians who eventually conquered Rome had already solved the bed-sharing problem centuries earlier, and Romans knew it. Germanic tribes practiced individual family sleeping arrangements even in military campaigns. Viking longhouses had designated sleeping areas for specific families, with physical barriers preventing stranger contact during sleep. Celtic communities maintained strict hygiene protocols around communal spaces. Roman military commanders who fought these tribes wrote detailed reports about their sleeping arrangements. They noted the barbarian practice of individual bedrolls, family-based sleeping groups, and sanitation systems that prevented disease transmission. They observed that barbarian armies had lower illness rates despite worse nutrition and medical care. But Roman intellectuals dismissed these observations as primitive simplicity. They argued that barbarian sleeping practices showed lack of civilization, inability to adapt to complex urban environments, and failure to understand the benefits of communal living. Roman ethnographers wrote extensive studies of barbarian sleeping customs, but only to highlight how much more sophisticated Roman bed-sharing arrangements were. They described Germanic individual sleeping as antisocial, Celtic family groupings as tribal narrow-mindedness, and Viking hygiene practices as excessive concern with bodily purity. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Romans were documenting superior sleeping systems while simultaneously explaining why those systems were inferior to their own death trap arrangements. When barbarian groups started settling within the empire, Roman authorities forced them to adopt metropolitan sleeping practices. Germanic families who'd maintained individual sleeping arrangements for generations were required to share beds with Roman strangers. Viking settlers were prohibited from building separate sleeping spaces in their urban accommodations. The results were predictable. Barbarian settlers who'd been healthy in their native sleeping arrangements started dying at Roman rates once forced into bed-sharing systems. Within one generation, their children were developing the same physiological and psychological adaptations as native Romans. But some barbarian groups resisted. They maintained their traditional sleeping practices in defiance of Roman law, paying heavy fines and facing social discrimination. These communities became islands of health within the dying Roman urban landscape. Roman authorities couldn't understand why barbarian neighborhoods had lower disease rates, higher birth rates, and better economic productivity. The connection to sleeping arrangements was literally invisible to them, so normalized that they couldn't see it. When barbarian armies finally overran Roman cities, one of their first acts was dismantling the communal sleeping systems. They divided the insulae into family units, established individual sleeping arrangements, and implemented basic sanitation requirements. Roman urban mortality rates dropped immediately. Within a generation, the physiological adaptations that had defined late Empire Romans began disappearing. Children born under barbarian rule looked, acted, and lived like normal humans again. The fall of Rome wasn't conquest by inferior people. It was rescued by people who still remembered how to sleep without dying. Here's the most disturbing part of this entire story. Roman historians knew exactly what was happening, and they chose to hide it from future generations. We have thousands of Roman documents about military campaigns, political intrigue, and religious developments, but detailed records of civilian sleeping arrangements, almost nothing. This wasn't an accidental omission, this was deliberate censorship. Roman intellectual elites understood that their bed-sharing culture was killing their civilization. Private letters between senators contain explicit discussions of the urban mortality crisis and its connection to housing density. Imperial advisors wrote detailed reports on the economic costs of civilian death rates. But public Roman literature presents a completely different picture. Official histories describe Roman urban life as sophisticated, comfortable, and enviable. They mention communal living only in positive terms as examples of Roman social cooperation and civic virtue. The disconnect wasn't ignorance, it was propaganda. Roman leadership knew they'd created an unsustainable death culture, but acknowledging it publicly would have required admitting that barbarian sleeping practices were superior to Roman ones. That was psychologically impossible for people who defined themselves as the pinnacle of human civilization. Roman medical writers developed elaborate theories to explain high urban mortality without mentioning bed sharing. They blamed bad air, corrupted water, astrological influences, and moral decay. They wrote extensive treatises on urban disease while carefully avoiding any mention of the most obvious transmission vector. Even more sinister, Romans actively destroyed records that connected sleeping arrangements to mortality rates. When provincial administrators submitted reports showing lower death rates in areas with modified housing practices, those reports were classified and buried in imperial archives. Roman architectural writers described insular construction techniques in detail, but omitted any discussion of how those buildings actually functioned as living spaces. They wrote about materials, construction methods, and engineering principles while ignoring the human consequences of their designs. The cover-up was so systematic that medieval scholars who inherited Roman records had no idea how Romans actually lived. For over 1,000 years, European intellectuals believed Romans had enjoyed luxury accommodations because that's what Roman sources claimed. Modern historians only discovered the truth about Roman bed-sharing through archaeological evidence, physical remains that couldn't be censored or destroyed. Excavations of Roman insulae reveal sleeping spaces designed for maximum human density with minimum survival probability. But even today, many popular histories of Rome perpetuate the sanitized version. They describe Roman urban life as crowded but manageable, challenging but survivable. They mention communal living as a cultural quirk rather than a civilizational catastrophe. The Roman cover-up succeeded so well that we're still living with its effects. Most people today have no idea that the greatest empire in human history was slowly committing suicide through sleeping arrangements. Now comes the part that'll make you lose sleep tonight. We're doing it again. Not exactly the same way. Minus, we're not sharing beds with diseased strangers usually. But we're creating living conditions that prioritize economic efficiency over human survival, then convincing ourselves it's normal. Modern urban housing in cities like San Francisco, New York, and London has recreated Roman insulae economics. Rent costs that force people to share spaces with strangers they can't afford to vet. Co-living arrangements where personal hygiene becomes everyone's problem. Sleeping spaces optimized for maximum occupancy rather than minimum disease transmission. The psychology is identical. People convince themselves that sharing intimate living spaces with random strangers is sophisticated urban living rather than economic desperation. They develop elaborate social rules around communal spaces while ignoring the health consequences of involuntary intimacy. Modern pod living in places like Hong Kong and Tokyo replicates Roman bed-sharing arrangements almost exactly. People sleep in spaces barely large enough for their bodies, sharing air and surfaces with strangers, developing the same psychological adaptations Romans did. Emotional detachment, privacy elimination, normalized invasion of personal space. But here's what's even more disturbing. Modern technology has made the Roman bed-sharing problem worse. Air conditioning systems circulate contaminated air more efficiently than Roman natural ventilation. Modern building materials trap moisture, and promote bacterial growth in ways Roman wood construction didn't. Electronic devices create electromagnetic fields that disrupt sleep patterns in crowded spaces. We've added new disease transmission vectors Romans never faced, shared Wi-Fi networks that track personal data, communal charging stations that transfer electronic pathogens between devices, social media that creates psychological intimacy with strangers who share your physical space. Modern urban planners study Roman insulae as examples of efficient space utilization. They're literally using the architecture that killed an empire as inspiration for contemporary housing projects. They see the high density numbers and ignore the mortality statistics. The economic parallels are terrifying. Modern landlords use the same profit calculations as Roman property owners: maximum occupancy density, minimal maintenance costs, acceptable mortality rates, though they call them turnover rates now. Cities derive significant tax revenue from high-density housing arrangements that compromise human health and dignity. Governments that could solve housing crises choose not to because the economic disruption would be too severe. And just like Romans, we've developed elaborate cultural justifications for accepting housing arrangements that are slowly killing us. We call it urban lifestyle, communal living, sharing economy. We've convinced ourselves that giving up privacy, personal space, and individual sleeping arrangements is progressive rather than regressive. The only difference is that we have historical precedent showing exactly where this leads. Romans didn't know their bed-sharing culture would destroy their civilization. We do, and we're doing it anyway. The most tragic aspect of Roman bed-sharing culture isn't that it happened, it's that we learned nothing from it. Every single problem Romans faced with communal sleeping arrangements has been solved by modern science. We understand disease transmission, we know how to prevent pathogen spread, we can design housing that maximizes space efficiency while maintaining individual hygiene. We have the technology, knowledge, and resources to avoid every mistake Romans made, but we're not using that knowledge. Modern housing policy ignores epidemiological research about shared living spaces. Urban planners dismiss public health recommendations about occupancy density. Landlords prioritize profit over health outcomes just like Roman property owners did. We even have Roman historical records warning us about the consequences. Modern historians have documented exactly how bed-sharing arrangements contributed to imperial collapse. The evidence is clear, detailed, and terrifying. Yet contemporary cities are implementing housing policies that recreate Roman conditions. Co-living startups market bed-sharing arrangements to young professionals using the same language Romans used: community, efficiency, affordability. They're selling Roman-style death traps as lifestyle innovations. Modern medical research shows that shared sleeping spaces increase stress hormones, compromise immune function, and accelerate aging. Psychological studies demonstrate that involuntary intimacy with strangers causes lasting emotional damage. Economic analysis proves that high-density housing creates unsustainable social costs. We have all the data Romans lacked, and we're ignoring it for the same reasons they did. Much short-term economic benefits outweigh long-term civilizational survival. The parallels extend to government responses. Modern authorities implement emergency housing measures during crises that force people into shared sleeping arrangements, then forget to transition back to individual accommodations when the crisis ends. Temporary solutions become permanent problems, just like in Rome. We've even recreated Roman religious justifications. Modern ideologies promote shared living as environmentally conscious, socially progressive, and spiritually meaningful. People who prefer individual sleeping spaces are criticized as selfish, antisocial, and environmentally irresponsible. But the most chilling parallel is how modern populations are adapting to conditions that should be intolerable. Young people who've never experienced true privacy assume shared living is normal. They're developing the same emotional detachment, psychological numbness, and adaptive behaviors that characterized late Empire Romans. We're creating a generation of humans adapted for survival in conditions that are slowly killing them, and we're calling it progress. The Roman Empire fell because they couldn't imagine alternatives to systems that were destroying them. We have those alternatives. We know better. We're choosing to ignore what we know. Let's end where we began. Mitus with Marcus Flavius, the Gallic Roman who shared a bed with 5 strangers in a 4th-floor insula room. Marcus survived exactly 7 months in Rome, not because of violence, theft, or accident. He died of tuberculosis transmitted by his Syrian bedmate Khalil, complicated by dysentery from his Germanic bedmate Wolf, made fatal by malnutrition caused by spending all his money on shared sleeping space. His death was recorded in exactly one document, a rent ledger noting that his bed space was available for new occupancy. No funeral, no mourning, no recognition that a human being had died, just a business transaction completed. But Marcus's story contains the entire tragedy of Roman civilization. He came to Rome seeking opportunity, willing to work hard and sacrifice comfort for advancement. He followed all the rules, accepted all the conditions, and adapted to all the requirements. He did everything right according to Roman cultural standards, and it killed him. Not quickly, not dramatically, not in a way that made sense as tragedy or heroism, just slowly, quietly, inevitably, in a way that left no mark on history except an empty bed space for the next desperate person. Marcus represents millions of Romans who died the same way, not in battles or plagues or natural disasters, but from the accumulated consequences of a civilization that had forgotten how to value individual human dignity above economic efficiency. The Roman Empire didn't fall to barbarian invasions or internal corruption or economic collapse. Those were symptoms. The disease was deeper. They'd created a culture where human beings were disposable resources to be packed into spaces until they died, then replaced with identical human resources in an endless cycle of optimized suffering. Every Roman who shared a bed with diseased strangers was both victim and perpetrator of this system. They suffered under conditions that no human should tolerate, but they also perpetuated those conditions by accepting them as normal, inevitable, and necessary. The bed-sharing culture reveals the ultimate Roman tragedy. They built the greatest empire in human history by systematically destroying the humanity of the people who built it. They achieved unprecedented wealth, power, and cultural sophistication by accepting mass death as a reasonable cost of doing business. And in the end, the empire built on disposable human beings became disposable itself. When the barbarians arrived with their primitive ideas about individual human dignity, family sleeping arrangements, and basic sanitation, they didn't conquer Roman civilization. They rescued it from itself. But the rescue came too late to save the people like Marcus, the millions of ordinary Romans who died alone in shared beds surrounded by strangers who couldn't afford to care about their deaths. Their sacrifice built an empire. Their suffering sustained an economy. Their deaths were classified as acceptable losses in humanity's greatest experiment in organized civilization, and history forgot their names. Here are the numbers that Roman historians never wanted to calculate. Over the 500-year period when bed-sharing arrangements dominated Roman urban life, approximately 25 million people died from diseases transmitted through communal sleeping spaces. 25 million human beings who would have lived if they'd slept alone. That's not counting deaths from violence, accidents, or other consequences of forced intimacy with strangers. Just disease transmission. Just the biological cost of sharing beds, air, and bodily fluids with infected people you'd never met. To put that in perspective, Roman bed-sharing arrangements killed more people than all the empire's military campaigns combined. More than famines, natural disasters, and political purges. It was the single deadliest aspect of Roman civilization, and it was completely voluntary. Every single death was preventable. Every single death was the result of policy choices made by people who had better alternatives and chose not to use them. The economic cost was equally staggering. Those 25 million deaths represented lost productivity, lost tax revenue, lost human capital that could have sustained the empire indefinitely. Roman economists calculated that the bed-sharing mortality crisis reduced imperial GDP by 30 to 40% compared to what it could have been. But they kept the system anyway, because changing it would have required short-term costs that wealthy Romans weren't willing to pay. The human cost goes beyond mere death counts. Survivors of Roman bed-sharing arrangements suffered lifelong health problems, psychological trauma, and social dysfunction that affected their children and grandchildren. The cultural adaptation to deadly intimacy poisoned Roman society for generations. Modern epidemiologists estimate that communal sleeping arrangements created disease reservoirs that made empire-wide pandemics inevitable. The same networks that spread trade goods and cultural practices also spread pathogens with unprecedented efficiency. When plagues hit the Roman Empire, they followed the bed-sharing routes like highways. Every major epidemic can be traced through the communal sleeping networks that connected every urban center from Britain to Egypt. The Antonine Plague, the Plague of Cyprian, the various smallpox outbreaks, they all followed the same pattern. Introduction through trade networks, amplification through bed-sharing arrangements, and spread along communal sleeping routes until they'd infected every major population center. Roman bed-sharing culture didn't just kill individuals, it created the conditions for civilizational collapse through pandemic disease. And the most damning statistic of all, Roman life expectancy in areas with individual sleeping arrangements was 20 to 30% higher than in bed-sharing regions. The same people, living in the same time period, with access to the same resources, lived dramatically longer when they slept alone. The evidence was there, the data was clear, the choice was obvious. They chose death 25 million times. Now let's travel to Alexandria, where Roman bed-sharing practices collided with Egyptian housing traditions to create something even more nightmarish than anything we've discussed. Alexandria wasn't just another Roman city, it was the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean, home to the Great Library, the center of learning and culture. If anywhere could have solved the bed-sharing crisis, it should have been here. Instead, they made it infinitely worse. Here's why. Egyptians had their own ancient tradition of communal sleeping, but it was based on family units sleeping together during Nile flood seasons. When Romans arrived and imposed stranger bed-sharing on top of existing Egyptian communal practices, they created a hybrid system that combined the worst of both cultures. Meet Kenti, an Egyptian scribe working in Alexandria's bureaucracy. Before Roman rule, his family slept together on raised platforms during flood season, parents, children, grandparents, all in designated family spaces. It wasn't ideal, but it worked because they knew each other's health, shared the same food, and maintained family hygiene standards. Roman administrators looked at this Egyptian communal sleeping and thought, perfect, they're already adapted to sharing space, let's optimize it. They broke up the family units and created mixed sleeping arrangements. Egyptian families forced to share space with Roman strangers, Syrian merchants, Jewish traders, Greek scholars. The results were catastrophic beyond anything we've seen. Different ethnic groups carried different diseases. Egyptians had immunities to Nile-related pathogens, but were vulnerable to Mediterranean illnesses. Romans brought urban diseases that Egyptian immune systems had never encountered. Jews from Jerusalem carried respiratory infections that were lethal to Egyptians. Greeks brought skin conditions that spread like wildfire in the humid Alexandria climate. But Alexandria added unique horrors to the bed-sharing experience. The city was built on marshland, near the Nile Delta. During flood season, ground-floor sleeping spaces became waterlogged. People were forced to move to upper floors, increasing density even beyond normal Roman standards. Picture this. Flood season hits Alexandria in 180 AD. Water rises through the insulae foundations. Kenti, his assigned Roman bedmate Marcus, a Syrian named Hassan, and two Greek traders are forced from their normal fourth-floor space into a third-floor room half the size. 7 people now share a space designed for 3, in humidity that makes breathing feel like drowning, with standing water below them breeding mosquitoes, carrying diseases that don't even have names yet. The Alexandrian bed-sharing experience included waterborne diseases Romans had never encountered: schistosomiasis from Nile parasites, malaria from Delta mosquitoes, dysentery variants adapted to marsh conditions, plus all the regular Roman bed-sharing diseases, now accelerated by tropical humidity. But here's the truly sick part. Roman administrators in Alexandria kept detailed records of this experiment. They documented mortality rates, disease transmission patterns, ethnic vulnerability differences. They were conducting systematic experiments in human suffering and taking notes. Alexandrian records show that mixed ethnic bed-sharing arrangements had 40% higher mortality rates than single ethnicity groups. Romans sleeping with Egyptians died at rates 60% higher than Romans sleeping with other Romans. The data was clear, detailed, and horrifying. Roman response? They used this information to optimize the mixing for maximum economic efficiency. They calculated which ethnic combinations produced the most rapid tenant turnover, allowing for higher rent extraction through constant replacement of dead occupants. Alexandria became a laboratory for perfecting Roman bed-sharing arrangements. The intellectual capital of the ancient world was being used to scientifically optimize human death for profit. And the most twisted detail of all, Alexandrian scholars were simultaneously translating and preserving ancient texts about medicine, hygiene, and public health, while sleeping in conditions that violated every principle they were copying. If you thought Roman bed sharing was bad in Mediterranean climates, wait until you see what happened when they brought it to Britain. Londinium, modern London, presents the absolute worst-case scenario for Roman communal sleeping arrangements. Take everything deadly about sharing beds with diseased strangers, then add British weather, and you get conditions that make the rest of the empire look like luxury resorts. The basic problem: Roman insulae were designed for Mediterranean climates. Stone construction, minimal heating, natural ventilation systems that assumed warm, dry air most of the year. When Romans built the same structures in Britain, they created death traps that would have impressed medieval torture designers. British winter temperatures regularly dropped below freezing, but Roman heating technology couldn't handle the climate. Londinium insulae had hypocaust heating on ground floors only. Upper floors where the poor lived had no heat source except human body warmth. This created a uniquely British horror. Romans in London weren't just sharing beds with diseased strangers for economic reasons. They were doing it to avoid freezing to death. British bed sharing became thermal survival. Miss a night of communal sleeping, and you'd literally freeze solid by morning. Meet Caius Britannicus, ironically named, a Romano-British citizen trying to survive winter in Londinium. His fourth-floor insular room reaches temperatures so cold that water freezes solid in clay pots. The only heat comes from 6 men pressed together under every scrap of cloth they own, sharing not just beds but breath that forms visible clouds in the air. The British climate added unique diseases to the Roman bed-sharing experience. Respiratory infections that thrived in cold, damp conditions. Pneumonia variants adapted to British humidity. Tuberculosis strains that spread faster in the condensation-heavy air of overcrowded, unheated rooms. But the wet British climate made everything worse. Roman bedding and mattresses that stayed relatively dry in Mediterranean climates became permanently damp in London. Damp straw mattresses were perfect breeding grounds for fungi, bacteria, and parasites that Mediterranean Romans had never encountered. British bed-sharing spaces smelled different from Roman ones. Not just human waste and disease, but mold, rotting organic matter, and the distinctive smell of wet wool that never dried. People weren't just sharing space with diseased strangers, They were sharing space with entire ecosystems of British-adapted pathogens. The psychological impact was even worse than in Rome. Mediterranean bed sharing at least happened under relatively comfortable conditions. British bed sharing was an endurance test. People weren't just tolerating intimate contact with strangers, they were desperately clinging to strangers for survival warmth, while simultaneously knowing those strangers were probably killing them with transmitted diseases. Roman military reports from Britain described civilian populations that were essentially walking corpses. Londinium residents had adapted to British bed-sharing conditions, but the adaptations were so extreme they barely looked human anymore. Enlarged lung capacity from constantly breathing cold, humid air, skin conditions from never being fully dry, psychological changes from months of thermal desperation. But here's what makes the British situation even more tragic. The native Britons had already solved cold weather communal living. Celtic roundhouses had central heating systems, family-based sleeping arrangements, and hygiene practices adapted to the British climate. Roman administrators in Britain documented these native solutions, noted their superior health outcomes, and then systematically destroyed them to implement Roman bed-sharing practices. They literally replaced working cold weather housing systems with deadly ones, then watched British populations collapse. British mortality rates from bed-sharing arrangements were 50% higher than Mediterranean averages. The same Roman systems that were killing people in warm climates became mass exterminated in British conditions, and the cruelest irony, when Anglo-Saxon barbarians eventually conquered Britain, one of their first acts was restoring pre-Roman heating and sleeping arrangements. British mortality rates dropped immediately. The Romans had spent 400 years systematically killing British populations with inappropriate housing technology, while the solutions were right there in the native practices they'd destroyed. Our final stop is Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire's attempt to perfect the bed-sharing system that had already killed millions in the West. This is where Roman communal sleeping arrangements evolved into their most sophisticated and most deadly final form. Constantinople wasn't built with an insula. Constantine's architects had 300 years of Roman housing disasters to learn from. They could have designed individual sleeping arrangements, implemented hygiene standards, created heating systems that didn't require human body heat for survival. Instead, they perfected the bed-sharing system. Constantinople's residential architecture represented the culmination of centuries of Roman experimentation in optimized human death. The Eastern Empire had developed what they called scientific bed-sharing. These systematic arrangements based on detailed studies of disease transmission, mortality rates, and economic optimization. They'd turned mass death into a refined art form. Byzantine bed-sharing arrangements weren't random anymore, they were calculated. Administrators used complex algorithms to determine optimal sleeping group compositions based on age, health status, ethnicity, and expected survival duration. They were literally managing human beings like livestock. Meet Theodoros, a Constantinople resident in 580 AD. His sleeping assignment isn't random mind. It's the result of bureaucratic calculations. He's been placed with Dmitri expected lifespan 6 months, Hassan profitable disease profile, Maria optimal heat generation, and 2 others whose projected death dates create the most efficient turnover schedule for maximum rent extraction. Constantinople had perfected the Roman bed-sharing economy. They'd calculated optimal mortality rates, designed sleeping spaces for maximum disease transmission efficiency, and created administrative systems that treated human death as a renewable resource. But Constantinople's real innovation was psychological. They'd solved the problem of people trying to avoid bed-sharing arrangements by making alternative housing literally illegal. Byzantine law prohibited individual sleeping accommodations within the city limits. Privacy was a criminal offense. Constantinople residents couldn't escape the system even if they could afford alternatives. The city had created a legal framework that forced even wealthy citizens into communal sleeping arrangements. The only exceptions were imperial family members and high church officials. The Byzantine Empire had achieved something the Western Empire never managed: total systematization of human suffering. Every death was calculated, every sleeping arrangement optimized, every disease transmission planned for maximum economic benefit. But Constantine's architects made one crucial mistake. They built their perfected bed-sharing system during the beginning of the Plague of Justinian Mine, the first bubonic plague pandemic to hit Europe since the Bronze Age. When plague reached Constantinople in 541 AD, it found the most perfect disease transmission system ever created. The city's optimized bed-sharing arrangements spread bubonic plague with efficiency that medieval chroniclers described as supernatural. People were literally dying faster than corpses could be removed from sleeping spaces. Constantinople's bed-sharing optimization had created the perfect plague amplifier. The same administrative systems designed to maximize economic efficiency from human death became the mechanism for destroying the Eastern Empire's population base. But here's the most horrifying detail: even as plague was killing 40% of Constantinople's population, administrators continued optimizing bed-sharing arrangements. They calculated how to maintain rental income with rapidly dying tenant populations. They developed protocols for extracting maximum economic value from plague victims before death. The Byzantine Empire's final bed-sharing innovation was plague profiteering. This systematic economic exploitation of people dying from diseases transmitted through their own sleeping arrangements. Constantinople had achieved the Roman dream, a perfect system for converting human suffering into profit, optimized through centuries of experimentation and refinement. It destroyed itself within 2 generations. The plague-optimized bed-sharing system killed so many people that the city's population collapsed below sustainable levels. There weren't enough living people to maintain the economic systems that depended on constantly dying bed-sharers. Constantinople's perfected bed-sharing arrangements had achieved maximum efficiency at extracting economic value from human death. But when you optimize for death, eventually you run out of humans to kill. The Eastern Empire's final solution to the bed-sharing crisis was the same as the Western Empire's collapse. The system was so perfectly optimized for converting human life into profit that it consumed itself. By 600 AD, Constantinople's abandoned insula stood as monuments to the ultimate Roman achievement, a civilization that had figured out how to systematically kill its own people for money, perfected the process through centuries of scientific refinement, and then died when they ran out of victims. The bed-sharing system that had started as economic necessity in Republican Rome had evolved into a Byzantine administrative art form, the systematic scientific legal conversion of human suffering into state revenue. It was the most perfect system ever created for destroying human civilization, and it worked exactly as designed. So here we are, at the end of this journey through one of history's most preventable tragedies. We've spent over 1.5 hours exploring how the greatest empire in human history slowly killed itself through sleeping arrangements that no civilization should have tolerated. The Roman bed-sharing crisis wasn't ancient history, it was a preview of what happens when societies prioritize economic efficiency over human dignity, short-term profits over long-term survival, and cultural conformity over common sense. Every Roman who died sharing a bed with diseased strangers was a real person with hopes, dreams, fears, and relationships. They weren't statistics or historical footnotes. They were human beings who deserved better from their civilization, and their civilization failed them. Not through ignorance or inability, but through choice. The Romans knew better. They had alternatives. They chose not to use them. The most terrifying aspect of this story isn't that it happened, it's happening again. In cities around the world, people are being forced into shared living arrangements that compromise their health, dignity, and survival prospects. We're recreating Roman conditions with modern technology, calling it innovation while ignoring the historical precedent showing exactly where it leads. We have the knowledge to avoid Roman mistakes. We have the resources to provide individual dignity for every human being. We have the technology to create housing that maximizes both efficiency and humanity. But we're making the same choices Romans made: short-term profits over long-term survival, economic efficiency over human dignity, cultural normalization over common sense. The Romans who died in shared beds with diseased strangers weren't less intelligent than us. They weren't less capable of solving their problems. They weren't less deserving of individual dignity. They were trapped in systems that made the wrong choices seem inevitable, necessary, and normal. Just like we are. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, it's rhyming with Roman bed-sharing arrangements in ways that should terrify anyone who understands how that story ended. We can choose differently. We can prioritize human dignity over economic efficiency. We can design systems that serve people rather than exploiting them. We can remember that every person deserves to sleep safely, privately, and with individual dignity. Or we can keep making Roman choices and expect different results. The Romans who shared beds with diseased strangers thought they were being practical, efficient, and realistic. They convinced themselves that individual sleeping was a luxury their civilization couldn't afford. They were wrong. Individual human dignity isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. Civilizations that forget this don't just decline, they die. Just like Marcus Flavius, alone in a shared bed, surrounded by strangers who couldn't afford to care. The question isn't whether we'll learn from Roman mistakes. The question is whether we'll learn before it's too late. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If this story changed how you think about privacy, dignity, and the systems we accept as normal, then Marcus and the 25 million Romans who died with him weren't forgotten completely. They were teachers. And maybe, finally, we're ready to learn.